What happens when a country builds its whole strategy around one narrow strip of water and then wakes up to find the world moving through it anyway? What if the biggest defeat in a crisis is not a missile strike, but the moment your threat stops scaring anyone? If you want sharp, simple breakdowns of the stories reshaping the world like this video, subscribe and share it with one friend who follows global politics. For years, the Strait of Hormuz has been one of the most dangerous pieces of water on Earth. It is narrow, it is crowded, it sits between Iran and Oman, and it carries an amount of energy that can shake the entire planet. Oil flow through the strait averaged about 20 million barrels a day in 2024. That is roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. Around 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas trade also moved through the same passage. And most of it had somewhere else to go, but not many practical ways to get there if this route broke down. That is why this water has always mattered more than its size. It is not just a channel. It is leverage. It is pressure. It is a bargaining chip. It is the kind of place where geography can become power very quickly. And for a long time, Iran understood that better than almost anyone. Tehran did not need to own the global economy to threaten it. It did not need to sink every tanker. It did not need to fight the United States Navy head-on. It only needed the world to believe that Hormuz could become too dangerous to trust. If the risk felt high enough, markets would panic, insurers would raise prices, shipping companies would hesitate, and governments would start asking how to calm things down. That fear alone was part of the weapon. That is why the title of this video matters so much. When we say Iran just lost control of Hormuz, we're not talking about a legal surrender. We're not talking about a flag coming down or a treaty being signed in public. We're talking about something more important in a crisis like this. We're talking about practical control, the ability to decide who moves, how they move, under what conditions they move, and whether the rest of the world believes you can stop them. That practical control is where the balance has started to shift. Because once ships keep moving without your permission, your threat gets smaller. Once a protected route stays open day after day, your leverage gets weaker. Once the world starts pricing in continuity instead of panic, your strongest pressure point begins to slip out of your hands. And that is where the F-35 enters the story. A lot of people hear the name F-35 and immediately imagine one thing: airstrikes, a stealth jet, a fifth-generation fighter, a machine built to survive in dangerous skies and hit hard. That image is real, but it is incomplete. In a crisis like Hormuz, the most important thing about the F-35 is not only what it can destroy. It is what it can see, what it can share, and what kind of confidence it gives to every other force operating around it. The jet is part of a bigger system, a floating signal to allies, a warning to adversaries, a sensor node in a layered surveillance and enforcement network. It tells everyone below that the sky is not empty, the sea is not unwatched, and escalation will not happen on Iran's terms alone. That matters, because the story of Hormuz is not really about one dramatic clash. It is about whether a country can still use uncertainty as a weapon when another side is building a clearer and clearer picture of everything happening in the battle space. And right now, the picture over Hormuz is getting harder for Iran to distort. Look at the basic reality of the strait itself. The world depends on it because there are very few clean alternatives. Flows through Hormuz made up more than 1/4 of total global seaborne oil trade and about 1/5 of global oil and petroleum product consumption. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates do have some pipeline capacity that can bypass the strait. And about 2.6 million barrels a day of capacity could be available in a disruption. But that still leaves a huge gap. This is not a route you replace overnight. This is not a risk you shrug off. That is also why the downstream effects are global. About 84% of the crude oil and condensate moving through Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian markets. About 83% of the liquefied natural gas going through the strait also went to Asia. China, India, Japan, and South Korea were the top destinations for crude moving through that water. So when Hormuz shakes, it is not just one region holding its breath. It is factories, utilities, shipping desks, insurance companies, and political leaders across continents watching the same narrow map. Now think about what Iran's strategy depended on. It depended on convincing all those players that the route could become too risky unless Tehran's interests were taken seriously. It depended on fear moving faster than ships. But fear has a weakness. It works best before a system adapts, and adaptation is exactly what changes the game. Once naval patrols harden, once surveillance improves, once commercial traffic is escorted, monitored, or redirected through routes that remain open, once boardings happen, once vessels are warned and turned away, once jets fly overhead and nobody doubts they can be backed by real force, then the crisis stops being a pure intimidation contest. It becomes a test of endurance, a test of logistics, a test of whose economy can absorb more pain, a test of who can sustain operations longer, That is a much more dangerous test for Iran, because Iran's power in Hormuz has always been strongest when it can blur the line between capability and uncertainty. It has missiles, it has drones, it has fast attack craft, it has mines, it has geography. It has a long history of using pressure, harassment, proxies, and calibrated escalation. All of that is real. But the moment a disciplined military system starts stripping away uncertainty, some of that leverage begins to fade. Suddenly the question is not, can Iran create danger? Of course it can. The real question becomes, can Iran create enough danger to shut the route on its own terms while facing persistent surveillance, persistent patrols, persistent boarding operations, and the visible presence of advanced American air power? That answer looks less convincing than it did before. And this is exactly why the F-35 changed everything. Not because it alone won the contest, not because it fired the decisive shot, but because it represents a new level of confidence in the coalition side of the equation. It tells shipping companies, allies, military planners, and Iranian commanders that the old playbook is no longer operating in darkness. If Iran tries to intimidate, someone is watching. If a vessel tests the line, someone can react. If a launch site hides, it may not stay hidden. If a swarm moves, it may not move unseen. In other words, the F-35 does not just add force, it changes psychology. And psychology is everything in a chokepoint crisis. Think about what Iran wanted from Hormuz at peak tension. It wanted recognition that its pressure could not be ignored. It wanted every tanker, every insurer, every foreign ministry, every energy market to silently ask the same question. What if Tehran really can squeeze this passage hard enough to force concessions? Now flip that question around. What happens when the market starts asking a different one? What if Iran can harass, threaten, and delay, but cannot actually restore decisive control over the water because the route keeps functioning under armed watch? That is the moment the center of gravity changes. And we have seen signals of that shift. The U.S. military described support for the launch of what it called Project Freedom in the Strait of Hormuz. It also stated that U.S. forces had redirected 91 commercial ships to ensure compliance with the blockade. The same reporting described operations where U.S. Marines boarded commercial vessels suspected of attempting to violate that blockade. Marines searched them and then released them after directing changes in course or confirming compliance. That is not symbolic theater. That is process. That is routine pressure. That is control expressed through repetition. Notice how important that is. Real control at sea is rarely cinematic. It is not always a giant explosion or a dramatic dogfight. Very often it looks boring. A warning, a boarding, a diversion, a search, a course change, another patrol, another aircraft overhead, another ship moving safely because the system around it held. And boring is exactly what Iran does not want. Iran needs the passage to feel unstable enough that every transit becomes a question mark. The other side wants the opposite. It wants the route to feel so managed, so watched, and so protected that the question mark fades. That is where enforcement and information merge. Because you cannot run a serious maritime pressure campaign on speeches alone. You need eyes. You need radar. You need aircraft. You need ships positioned to intercept. You need boarding teams ready to move. You need commanders who can make rapid decisions. And you need the other side to know all of that exists before they take the next step. This is why advanced aircraft matter even when they are not actively shooting. The F-35 is part of a wider architecture of awareness. The more complete the picture, the harder it becomes for Iran to turn confusion into leverage. It is one thing to threaten traffic when the sea feels open and ambiguous. It is another when commercial movement happens under a security umbrella that can see farther, coordinate faster, and escalate from a stronger position. And if this breakdown is helping you see the map behind the headlines, tap, like, subscribe, and send this video to someone who still thinks this story is only about oil prices. Because it is not only about oil prices, it is about what happens when military technology, maritime enforcement, and economic dependence collide in one place. It is about the difference between formal ownership and functional power. And it is about whether Iran can still convert risk into leverage faster than the United States. And its partners can convert presence into stability. So let's slow down and make the core argument simple. Iran has not lost geography. Iran has not disappeared from the map. Iran still sits on one side of the strait. Iran still has the ability to threaten, disrupt, and punish, but losing control does not mean losing the coastline. It means losing the ability to dictate the terms of movement in a way the world is forced to obey. That is the key distinction. If commercial traffic can continue through protected or managed routes, if vessels can be redirected, if suspected violators can be boarded, if naval enforcement can keep functioning day after day, then Iran's bargaining position weakens whether or not its leaders admit it. And the longer that condition holds, the worse the problem becomes for Tehran. Why? Because every day of sustained pressure has an economic cost. Oil infrastructure, export confidence, domestic expectations, foreign currency flows, energy revenues, and basic state credibility all live inside that cost. A government can sound strong on television while still bleeding underneath. It can issue warnings while still watching leverage drain away in slow motion. That is why this crisis is so revealing. It exposes the difference between being able to threaten a route and being able to control outcomes inside that route. Iran can still threaten. Nobody serious denies that. But if the route remains open enough for global trade to keep moving, then threat is no longer the same as command. And command is what really matters. Now let's talk about the emotional side of this, because geopolitics is not only a board game. Nations build stories about themselves. Regimes build legitimacy around strength. They tell their people and their rivals that they can impose costs, shape events, and force others to respect their red lines. When a system built on defiance starts losing visible leverage, it creates a dangerous gap between rhetoric and reality. That gap is where mistakes happen. A leadership under pressure may talk louder because it feels weaker. It may test boundaries more often because routine control is slipping. It may rely on symbolism because the practical picture is moving against it. That is one reason Hormuz remains so dangerous, even if Iran's position is weakening. A declining pressure point can still be explosive. In fact, it can become more explosive. Because if Tehran believes the world is getting used to a version of Hormuz that functions without Iranian permission, then the temptation grows to prove otherwise. Not necessarily through a full war, not necessarily through a suicidal open clash, but through calibrated danger, enough to remind everyone that the risk never disappeared. This is where the story becomes more than a headline about jets. The F-35 changes the equation, but it does not erase peril. It raises the cost of Iranian action. It improves awareness, it strengthens enforcement, it signals readiness. But it does not create peace by magic. What it does is make it harder for Iran to win the psychological contest through ambiguity alone. That is a huge difference. Because in the old model, Tehran could lean on uncertainty and hope the market, the shippers and foreign governments did the rest. In the new model, uncertainty is being crowded out by visible structure. Patrols, air cover, boardings, rerouting, surveillance, repetition, and repetition changes confidence. When one ship gets through, it is an incident. When dozens get through, it becomes a pattern. When that pattern holds, the market starts treating it as a reality. And once a new reality settles in, it is much harder to frighten the world back into the old one. That is what Iran is really fighting against. Not only the United States, not only naval patrols, not only stealth fighters. It is fighting against normalization. The normalization of an open or managed southern route. The normalization of commercial vessels moving under protection. The normalization of the idea that Hormuz can function even while Iran objects. That is the deepest strategic loss of all. Because once your enemy proves the world can route around your coercion is no longer the center of the board. It becomes one factor among many, still dangerous, still serious, but no longer decisive. And that brings us back to the phrase in the title, U.S. F-35s changed everything. Why do I say that so strongly? Because the jet stands at the intersection of three things Iran least wants to face at the same time. First, visibility. The F-35 is part of a battlefield awareness system that makes hidden movement harder, surprise harder, and denial harder. Second, credibility. A stealth fighter overhead tells everyone that the force supporting maritime operations is not symbolic. It is modern, survivable, and ready. Third, confidence transfer. Commercial actors do not need to understand every tactical detail. They only need to believe that the route is being watched and defended by a serious military system. The F-35 helps create that belief. And in Hormuz, belief can move markets almost as fast as missiles can. That is why the aircraft's presence matters far beyond the runway or the carrier deck. An F-35B attached to Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 121 was described taking off from USS Tripoli while deployed to support maritime security and stability in the Middle East. Read that language carefully. Maritime security and stability. That is the mission logic. Not random display, not empty posture, a layered attempt to keep the pressure on Iran while keeping the route functioning. Now imagine how that looks from Tehran. You spent years telling the world this water could become a nightmare. You built your image around resilience, pressure, and strategic patience. You assumed that in a crisis, fear would multiply your power. Then, an opposing system starts proving, day by day, that traffic can be monitored, violators can be intercepted, and your threat can be managed rather than obeyed. That is not just a military setback. It is a narrative wound. Because authoritarian systems can endure pain, they can endure sanctions, they can endure isolation. But they hate visible loss of leverage. They hate moments when the world sees the difference between their claims and their actual room to maneuver. And Hormuz is becoming exactly that kind of moment. Still, we have to be honest. There is a reason this story is not over. Iran still has tools. It can still threaten tanker traffic. It can still use drones, it can still lean on proxy escalation, it can still test lines with small craft, missile deployments, or gray zone moves designed to create headlines. It can still force insurance costs higher with one serious incident. It can still manufacture fear faster than many governments can calm it. That means nobody should confuse weakening leverage with harmlessness. A cornered actor can remain extremely dangerous, sometimes more dangerous, and that is why the American side is not treating this like a solved problem. If it were solved, you would not need the aircraft, the ships, the boardings, the enforcement, the public messaging, and the constant evidence of presence. The system is still active because the danger is still real. But active danger is not the same as dominant control. That is the heart of the whole issue. Iran can make Hormuz dangerous. The question is whether Iran can still make Hormuz obedient. That looks far less likely. And if you've stayed with me this far, hit like, subscribe for more deep global breakdowns, and share this video with that one friend who always says geopolitics is too complicated to explain clearly. Because sometimes one narrow stretch of water can explain the logic of an entire region. So let's zoom out even more. What happened here is a lesson in how modern power actually works. A choke point is never controlled by geography alone. Geography gives you the chance. Control comes from the ability to monitor, deny, protect, punish, and sustain. In older eras, a threatening coastline and a few military assets might have been enough to keep everyone guessing. Today, the side that sees more, coordinates faster, and stays on station longer can reshape the meaning of the same map. That is what we are watching in Hormuz. The coastline did not move. The water did not move. But the meaning of the water changed. Instead of being a pure Iranian pressure point, it is turning into a contested corridor where US-backed maritime order is proving more durable than Tehran expected. That change carries consequences far beyond shipping. It affects deterrence. It affects diplomacy. It affects how regional states calculate risk. If the United States and its partners can keep commerce flowing through one of the world's most sensitive choke points under direct pressure, that sends a message to allies. Washington may still be willing to absorb cost to preserve strategic routes. It also sends a message to adversaries. Coercion works best when nobody shows up with a system stronger than your threat. And for countries watching from the Gulf, from Asia, and from every energy market linked to this route, that message matters. Saudi Arabia alone accounted for 38% of total Hormuz crude flows in 2024, with 5.5 million barrels a day of crude and condensate moving through the strait. That tells you something important. Hormuz is not an abstract symbol. It is a live artery for major producers and major consumers. When its stability changes, strategic behavior changes with it. It also changes diplomacy. Once Iran realizes that the world may be adapting around its coercive pressure instead of giving into it, the diplomatic table looks different. Demands that once sounded powerful begin to sound expensive. Delays begin to hurt the delaying side. Time stops being neutral. And this may be the most painful shift for Tehran of all. Because Iran's leverage in Hormuz always depended on urgency. The faster fear spread, the stronger Iran looked. But if the other side can create an operating reality where the route remains usable, then time starts working in the other direction. Every day that passes without restored Iranian control becomes evidence that control is already slipping. That is why maintaining continuity matters so much. A single dramatic action gets headlines. 100 ordinary successful transits change the argument. This is also why the details are so important. The strait is deep enough and wide enough to handle the world's largest crude tankers. Most volumes moving through it have no practical alternatives. That means the side-keeping movement alive is not just winning a tactical contest. It is preserving a global function. When you preserve function under threat, you undercut the threat itself. That is exactly what Iran did not want. Iran wanted the world to see dependence and panic. Instead, the world is starting to see dependence and adaptation. And adaptation is poison to coercive leverage. Now let's be fair and ask the hardest question. Could Iran still shock the system? Yes. A mine, a missile, a swarm attack, a damaged tanker, a miscalculation at sea. Any one of those could send insurance prices spiking and put markets back into panic mode. The strategic risk is still enormous. Nobody should romanticize maritime confrontation in a choke point this sensitive. But notice how different that question is from the old one. The old question was, can Iran hold the world hostage through Hormuz? The newer question is, can Iran still produce enough disruption to break a growing system of protected movement and restore the fear that once did most of the work for it? That is a weaker position. It is a more desperate position. And desperate positions are unstable. This is why every piece of the enforcement network matters. The aircraft matter, the ships matter, the marine boarding teams matter, the rules matter, the routing decisions matter, the public messaging matters. None of these pieces alone decides the contest. Together, they create something powerful, an alternative reality to the one Iran was trying to impose. In Iran's preferred reality, no one moves with confidence unless Tehran accepts it. In the alternative reality now taking shape, ships move because a larger security architecture is willing to guarantee enough order to keep them moving. That is the real battle. Not who shouts louder, not who releases the most dramatic statement, not who trends for 24 hours, but whose version of reality becomes normal. And right now, normalization is drifting away from Iran. That is why even the symbolism around the F-35 matters. A stealth fighter in the region is not only a tactical platform, it is a visual shorthand for a modern military ecosystem. It tells everyone from ship captains to state planners that this is not a vacuum. It tells Iran that any attempt to exploit ambiguity will be met inside a denser net of awareness than before. And it tells markets that there is at least a serious effort to impose continuity on chaos. If that effort holds, then Iran's old formula starts to fail. Threat plus geography no longer equals command. Not automatically, not under pressure, not when the other side is proving, transit by transit, that the route can still function. Now think about the political meaning of that inside Iran. If the regime sells itself as a power that cannot be ignored, then being bypassed is humiliating. Not bypassed physically, because Iran is still there. Bypassed strategically. Bypassed in the sense that others keep operating around the pressure. Bypassed in the sense that the world starts learning how to live with your threats instead of yielding to them. That kind of loss is quiet at first, but quiet losses can be the most dangerous because leaders often overreact to them. A visible military defeat can force adjustment. A slow, invisible loss of leverage often tempts escalation. That is why Hormuz is still on a knife edge. Iran may be losing control, but it has every reason to deny that loss, delay that recognition, and search for moments that can reverse the psychological tide. One sharp incident could still change perception. One severe disruption could still remind everyone how fragile the situation remains. So no, this is not the moment to relax. It is the moment to understand. To understand that the contest has entered a different phase, a phase where survival of the shipping lane matters more than speeches, a phase where repetition matters more than rhetoric, a phase where surveillance, enforcement, and endurance may be worth more than dramatic firepower alone, and a phase where the F-35 matters precisely because it is not acting alone. It is the face of a system, the sharp edge of a wider architecture. The aircraft people notice first, attached to the network they often miss. And if this video helped connect the dots for you, don't just watch quietly. Like it, subscribe, and share it with someone who wants the real story before the next headline tries to oversimplify it. Because the real story is this. Iran built years of leverage around the idea that Hormuz could always become the world's nightmare. But a nightmare loses power when people learn how to stay awake inside it. That is what American presence, maritime enforcement, and advanced air power are doing here. They are not making the risk disappear. They are making the risk harder for Iran to monopolize. They are taking away the exclusive ownership of fear. And once fear stops belonging to you, control starts slipping away. That is why the title is not just dramatic. It points to the central truth of the moment. Iran may still stand on the shore. Iran may still threaten the passage. Iran may still hurt the system. But Iran is no longer the only actor deciding whether the system functions. That is the loss. Not the loss of geography, the loss of veto power, the loss of automatic obedience, the loss of the old assumption that if Tehran says this water will choke, the world has no choice but to stop and listen. Now the world is listening to something else. Radar tracks, naval warnings, boarding reports, commercial movements that continue anyway, statements about redirected ships, energy data showing just how much is at stake, and above all, the visible proof that powerful states are willing to keep this corridor alive rather than surrender it to intimidation. That is why this matters far beyond Iran and far beyond the Gulf. Because if a strategy built on chokepoint fear fails here, every government studying pressure tactics takes notes. Every ally studies resolve. Every market studies resilience. Every adversary studies where coercion stops working. This is not just a regional standoff. It is a lesson in 21st century power. The lesson is simple. The side that can keep systems running under threat often wins more than the side that can threaten to break them. And the final irony is brutal. Iran tried to use Hormuz as a tool to squeeze the world. But if the route keeps functioning without Iranian permission, then Hormuz becomes the place where Iran's own limits are exposed to the world instead. That is a deeper defeat than a lost headline. That is a strategic humiliation. And unless Tehran finds a way to reverse the psychology of this crisis, that humiliation will grow one transit at a time, one patrol at a time, one failed attempt at restored fear at a time. So the next time you hear that Iran controls Hormuz, ask a harder question. Controls it how? On paper? On a map? Or in the only way that matters during a real crisis, the power to stop movement and make the world obey? Because if ships keep moving, if enforcement keeps holding, and if the sky above the strait stays filled with aircraft that signal confidence instead of retreat, then the answer is changing right in front of us. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. Iran did not lose Hormuz in one blast. It is losing it in the one way regimes fear most, by watching the world adapt without them.